Hello. Hi. Hopefully you can all see me and hear me and see my screen. And then if I haven't, hopefully someone will let me know. Um, Starting to get the hang of these webinars after 1,000,001 super awkward solo interactions with my laptop. But thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Laura Oxford. I'm Global Head of Cultural Insights here at We Are Social. I'm assuming all of you know, but for those of you that don't, We Are Social is a global creative agency. We're based in 16, we've got 16 offices across, I think, around 12 or 13 markets. We work with clients from Lego, YouTube, Adidas, Guinness, IKEA, Audi, a ton, so many. And we're a digital global creative agency. So yeah, you know who I am. You know why we're here, I hope, to understand if influencers will still have value after lockdown. I'm going to try really hard to make that a question I actually answer rather than it just being a clickbaity title that you never actually get an answer to. But yeah, I'm going to crack on. There's a ton of stuff for us to get through in here. There were just so many insights. But hopefully I'm going to speed through and try and leave a bit of time at the end for questions. So if you can just leave any questions in the Q&A, I'll get background to those towards the end, but my colleague Alice is going to come on with me and read some of them out. So yeah, perfect. So we've spent recent weeks and yeah, let's face it, months, because time's been going at an unprecedented rate, scrolling through our feeds more than ever. So over the course of March alone, web browsing was up 70% and social media engagement was up 61%. And it's been leaving a lot of us feeling quite anxious about our screen time and about the amount of time we're spending scrolling through social media, with a lot of people like Rob Hurley here talking about how it's pretty embarrassing how much time we're spending scrolling right now. But as a result of this, it's probably not that surprising that we're engaging with influencers more as well. So daily accumulated likes on Instagram posts tagged #ad were up 76% globally over the first 2 weeks of March. And between Q4 of 2019 and Q1 of 2020, there was a 22% increase in Instagram campaign impressions and 27% on TikTok. So what we're seeing is that there's been obviously a huge uptick in how much engagement there is online. What we're seeing as well, and this is data from the excellent Michael in our Australian office, we analysed the top 3,500 influencer accounts versus the top 3,500 brand accounts globally on Instagram over the past 2 months. And we can see that influencers across the board are drawing far higher engagement. So general engagement is up 4 times. They're attracting 18 times higher engagement in terms of medium engagement per post. And they've also got 7 times more followers. So we're really seeing that influencers are attracting a huge amount of traffic right now. But all the same, they've also been drawing a lot of bad press. And I think, no doubt, some of you that are attending today will have seen the amount of reading that there's been being like, is influencer marketing dead? Are influencers useful to us anymore? Right at the beginning, this article on the left talks about how at the beginning, a lot of the bad behavior of influencers, like leaving cities and like going outside when they shouldn't have been, was actually causing their followers to follow suit. We're seeing a lot of research around how influencers are among the key distributors of coronavirus misinformation. This article actually talks about influencers all the way from micro through to macro and celebrities. So this particular article talks about how Woody Harrelson is apparently one of the biggest proponents to talk about how 5G is causing coronavirus, which did not know. And then we're also seeing on a global scale a lot of these articles saying, is this the end of influencers? And I guess having approached this subject from the way that I have, initially I was quite surprised to see so much of that commentary. But I think this quote from Anna Angelic really sells it well, which is that influencers by definition have to promote themselves, and that's counter to the mood that's happening right now. At a time when we're being faced with a daily death toll, we don't want to see aspirational living. We want to see real people. We want to see people coming together. And I think the conventional version of influence that we think of, people who are constantly jet setting, wearing luxury goods, constantly kind of publishing around this aspirational lifestyle, that doesn't make sense within this context. But all the same, what we're actually seeing is that creators and influencers have so many other ways that they can contribute in a really positive way to the cultural landscape. So in the US, we've seen John Krasinski, oh my God, I can never say his name. John Krasinski has been running Some Good News, which has just been an incredible source of positivity during this time. And in one particular video, he was helping teenagers recreate prom online for those that couldn't have it in real life, using celebrities like Billie Eilish to ultimately perform at their digital prom. In Italy, Chiara Ferragni has currently, the number is still going up every day, but as it stands, has raised over €4 million for emergency services in Italy. And in the UK, we're seeing that Joe Wicks is hosting PE classes to kids and parents on his social channels, essentially giving parents a way to keep their kids active, keep them fit, and hopefully make them tired enough that they'll go to bed at the end of the day. So with all of these different mixed messages coming out around creators, but also so many incredible ways that they're helping us, we set out to explore how content creation has changed during the crisis and what role creators can play as we move out of lockdown as well. Because obviously we've been in lockdown for a long time now and we're starting to see light at the end of the tunnel. So a lot of what we're thinking about now is how we can move forward and what life after lockdown is really going to look like. So in order to do this, it was a great opportunity to mobilise our network. As you can see here, and as I mentioned earlier, we've got 16 offices scattered all over the world with culturally connected native speakers that enable us to really gain the cultural context and local nuance that you couldn't get otherwise. And so with that in mind, we mobilised 6 of these offices from the US, the UK, Germany, Italy, China and Australia to help us build a global perspective on content creation and influencer marketing and how that stuff has been impacted by COVID-19. This is a really brilliant opportunity for myself as well, as I've been with the agency for about a year, and a really, really big part of what my role is about is mobilising some of our offices and helping us really make the most of the cultural visibility that gives us on a global scale. And so I'd like to give a shout out to Matt and Gina, Kate and Jolie, Donato, Maren and Sean, who all contributed to this from all over the world, something which is surprisingly easier given that we're all working from home right now as well anyway. So we're all seeing each other on a video screen. So it's only the time differences that we really have to get past. So who we spoke to, obviously you'll get familiar with these guys a lot more over the course of this deck, but it was a brilliantly diverse panel and really kind of hammered home the fact that by speaking to creators and influencers and people that are really tapped into their audiences, there are so many incredible insights that you can get out of them. They have such amazing visibility on what their audiences are doing, how they're behaving, even stuff like what time of day they're online and things like that. So everything that we got out of this, as you'll see from the sheer number of insights that we have, it was really incredible to see all of this come together. So, and just to shout out again before we go into the insights, I will be answering questions at the end of this deck, so please feel free to type into the Q&A if you have anything that you want to ask. Great. So the insights we've split out into 3 key sections: creating in a crisis, so talking about specifically content creation, how creators have adapted and how that's going to look moving forwards. Following in a crisis, so really understanding how audience needs have changed during this time and what brands can do about it. And then, of course, after lockdown, so asking our panel to predict what will change in the long term as a result of these shifts. As a researcher, it's always quite stressful asking people to predict the future, but seeing what came out consistently across all markets was really, really fascinating. It's just worth noting at this point as well that if you operate in any of the markets specifically, there are local deliverables for each of the markets that we went into. So you can go and find those really kind of local nuanced territories if you see fit. So, creating in a crisis. So this is a very obvious one, but I think it's something which we need to kind of set the scene, which is that pre-pandemic content very quickly lost relevance at the beginning of the crisis, and at the beginning of lockdown. So as Flex Mami from Australia says, her audience no longer responds well to beauty tutorials and applying makeup because it doesn't suit their reality. They respond to videos of her putting up wall art, cooking, or things that are attributed to what it means to being at home. And that's what we've definitely seen during the lockdown. But what we've also seen, as she kind of touched upon, and what Melissa Collage from Germany touches upon, is the fact that a lot of the pre-existing posts and the posts that previously got a lot of engagement could often be perceived as quite vacuous. So she talks about posting selfies, but I think fashion and beauty brands have been especially hit by this. The community reacts very differently in times of crisis. So the content that normally worked before won't necessarily work now. But what brands can learn from this is that they can really learn to look to creators to learn how to adapt. And this example on the right, I think, is an incredible example of this, where Emma Scott Child, who was one of the creators we spoke to in the UK, she's been hosting live art classes on Instagram, kind of similar to the Joe Wick stuff, but with art classes. She writes craft books and art books, and so that's where her specialty lies. But Random House saw what she was doing, saw how much value she was adding, and so they took their Peter Rabbit series and asked her to do Peter Rabbit related artwork, I think every Friday, and then they sponsor her to do one of those sessions. So these were sessions she was already doing, it's just now she actually gets paid to do it, and all she has to do is pivot her content a little bit. I think this is a great example of how brands can kind of look to creators to understand where there is value being added and kind of move into it without, badging or coming off with too explicit marketing, which hasn't really won a lot of favour at this time. Next, what we're seeing is that the crisis has fed creativity. And I think this is especially important when thinking about how we engage with influencers and creators, because at their core, all of these people are people who are explicitly identifying as creative people. They've monetized their creativity. And so this insight is an incredibly relevant one for them. Emma talks about the fact that she wrote her book last year and so was exhausted by it and didn't have any new ideas. And she said she got to the point where she thought she'd never have an idea again. And now, even though she's juggling every day, and it's tricky because she has her own kids to look after as well, she's really enjoying having this creative patch again, like having something to create for. Dante in the US really kind of built on top of this as well, tying back to the fact that immediately his thought was like, hosting virtual editing courses, virtual photography workshops, and working a lot with other creators to really develop his ideas and find ways to really make everyone more creative at this time, which is something, of course, we've all seen because everyone's, painting or taking up fitness or baking sourdough. Like now is the time for creators to really share their knowledge too. An amazing brand example again of this is Apple's At Home series. So obviously shot on iPhone is a really, really established move from them anyway. So putting out an open brief to the global creative community to try and think about what that series could look like in lockdown made total sense for them. Creators diversifying their content. So again, this is something which was fascinating and something that I think I hadn't really clocked right at the beginning of the lockdown when we first started this process. But as Flex Mammy says in Australia, a lot of creators and brands are starting to diversify their offering beyond their specialty. The stakes are so much higher and people want new things. So it's about finding different ways to bring value and really adding benefit to people's lives. And what this means is that some people are moving beyond their verticals altogether. Makai is a beauty blogger, and she's a hairstylist as well. She works a lot in fashion, but now she's at home all the time. She started cooking and she's become, the quintessential quarantine chef. And as a result, she's been making all of this cooking content, still bringing it back to her heritage. She cooks a lot of Jamaican and Caribbean food and really adding that cultural narrative in there. But the reality is that even though food was never in her remit previously, this is something that she plans on continuing moving forward. And you could even see it when I interviewed her on Instagram Live, and in the comments when she mentioned her food content, everyone was like, yes, like really living for her cooking content. So I think people are really open to that. And this is especially going to bring up a lot of potential opportunities for brands in that space, cooking brands, homeware brands, craft brands, any brands which already have a natural fit in this space. Brands targeting families, we're going to see them have a whole wealth of creators at their disposal now to kind of diversify the way they would usually do partnerships. On top of this, Dante and a number of other people that we spoke to also talked about the fact that some are experimenting with new channels. So creators are new to TikTok are taking the time to experiment the platform and figuring out how they can express themselves using that medium. Obviously, TikTok has such a huge wealth of tools at its disposal, not to mention all of the memes and the different content that you can create on there. It's not something you can it's not like Instagram where you can just take a picture and upload it. There's so much more craft attached to it. And creators are really using this time to figure out how to use it. I think I read something a couple of weeks ago about how it just hit, I'm going to say 2 million downloads. If I'm wrong, correct me on that. But it had the best quarter of any social app ever. And I think something that we will absolutely see. Anyone who was saying, is TikTok going to stick around after this time in quarantine? I think it's safe to say that it definitely is. Creators are keeping tabs on their audience. This is something that I tapped into a little bit before, but it's been fascinating to see how many different ways there are with them to do this. But there's been this sense, as we mentioned before, the previous content hasn't been working so well. So creators are really staying on top of what their audiences want and that trajectory, because that trajectory is constantly evolving. It's not like everyone just moved into lockdown, found their new habits, and then stopped evolving. I think we've all seen the evolution of this crisis unfold. And creators are really, really tapped into that. So Anna in Germany talked about how she was keeping on top of it with Q&As. Rambo FYI in the UK, he felt like Q&As were a little bit stilted, and that especially if he wanted to engage with his audience, they'd always end up asking the same questions. So instead, he'd been playing Monopoly with his followers on Instagram. So he'd basically go on there and then bring someone in with them, and they tell him what move they wanted to make every time he rolled the dice for them. And then he'd swap out different people every 10 minutes, and they just talk about, music, life, the virus, how they were feeling, mental health, and so on. And so he's been using that to really engage with his followers on the regular. And as Guy says in Australia, I think creators are feeling so tapped into their audiences, it would be crazy for brands not to be tapping into that. Even with this piece of work, it's been hugely beneficial for so many of our clients, because across these industries, we have so many unique insights into how people are behaving and how that's changing over time. And I think continuing to do that as we move forward will be incredibly important. Very much taps into the Do the Right Thing report that We Are Social released a couple of weeks back. This whole idea of listening to your audience, monitoring their behaviour and acting upon it, I think is so resonant here. They've been finding ways to delight. So Haiana Luciano in Italy, something that was incredibly interesting that came through was just how much people are engaging with more spontaneous content. And as I mentioned before, we're seeing that a lot of the creators talked about the fact that people are on their phones. I mean, I know we shouldn't be, because many of us are still at work, but because our routines have been in flux, people are on their phones far more often throughout the day, especially again for like parents. Emma was saying about how usually you would never see people on their phones in the middle of the day because they'd be working, and she would never think about putting content in at that time. But now people are engaging more sporadically, and so they're seeking more spontaneous content. They're seeing much more direct interactions. If you cook something and share it, people are immediately asking for builds on that recipe, replacement ingredients, things like that. And there's this real sense of surprise and delight in having these back and forth so often and so regularly. Another way that creators are doing this as well is through, as Dante says in this middle quote, is through collaborating to facilitate these moments. So we're looking to our peers. Collaboration between creators is thriving like never before. Really great example of this, I don't know if you saw it on the weekend. House Party basically hosted a kind of digital festival where it enlisted, I think, over 40 massive acts, like really like macro level talent, to do cooking classes, live music performances, live coaching, and they basically had it live throughout the day. So anytime you went on the app just to speak to someone, speak to your friends or your family or whatever, there would also be, I don't know, Katy Perry performing on there at the same time that you could just quickly switch in and out of. And this idea of really capturing this level of intimacy with high-level talent is something which is really surprising and delighting audiences at this time, or at least it has been. As we'll get to later, there's definitely also been a homogenization of content, and people are starting to get a bit fatigued by certain types of content. But there are still so many ways to delight people. Another really great example of this, which is much more tailored, is in the UK. This piece of work is actually done by We Are Social, where for Uber Eats, give you a little bit of context on this. On Twitch, I'm sorry to those of you that already know, but there's you can basically raid someone's stream. So if you're running a live stream and you've got 100 people watching you live stream, you can choose to raid someone else's stream where you go in there and your video appears alongside their video, and all of the people watching your channel go over to their channel as well. So for Uber Eats, what we did was we got massive, huge, super famous Twitch streamers to raid someone's channel which had 0 viewers, and then that really famous streamer would give the smaller streamer Uber Eats coupons. So even like with something like that, what you're seeing is again this real surprise and delight, and actually having that captured in film as well. So we're seeing a lot of these moments come to life, and I think there's so many opportunities for brands to really facilitate and harness these moments to kind of generate some positive energy at this time. Many creators are feeling an increased sense of social responsibility. So this is something that kind of makes all the sense in the world. But again, I hadn't really considered it when we started this research, which is that influencers and creators are super aware of the influence that they carry at this time. Anna Kraft in Germany says, you're an influencer, you're a role model. As a public figure, you have a responsibility. And you need to take on that responsibility at times like these. So at a time when everyone is supposed to be staying at home, there are so many, we should all be doing the right thing. Influencers are in a position of influence, and now is the time that they really feel like they have to exercise that. We had a similar thing happening with Haiyan and Luciano in Italy, because Haiyan has Chinese heritage. And at the beginning, obviously, there were so many racially driven narratives around the coronavirus, a lot of prejudice towards the Chinese community. And they felt like it was incredibly, incredibly important that they spent time, especially in Italy, where it's not where the Chinese community is, to make a point of addressing people in that market and making sure that they knew how to address that in the right way. And it was something that we also saw replicated in the UK as well. Makai talking about, in her line of work, it can't just be about going out and making fashion content all over town. And she made a very astute recommendation, which is that brands should really only be partnering with lockdown savvy creators. Of course, we always have brands look at the feeds of the people that they're looking to partner with. But I think right now it's a very specific thing that the people we are partnering with should do. They should be pushing the right message when it comes to lockdown and when it comes to the pandemic. There is a ton of amazing examples of where we've seen this as well, where we've really seen people start to virtually signal around the world. So in Germany, the Mask Off initiative helped influencers signal their support, and this was picked up by really, really small influencers all the way through to massive local celebrities. In China, where the narrative has moved on a little bit more, there's been a huge explosion among beauty influencers of using their platforms to not just promote CBT, Chinese beauty, which is something which wasn't as big a narrative before, but also to use their platforms to boost their pride in using these products. Especially in China, we've seen that a lot of the local brands poured a huge amount of money into local healthcare to help curb the crisis. And so now what we're really seeing is consumers and influencers really exercising their platforms to celebrate that. And then lastly, of course, there was One World Together at Home, which, depending on who you're talking to, was potentially a little bit cringy, but again was a brilliant example of a global virtue signalling of the new lockdown rules at that time. Cool. So following in a crisis, I think I'm more or less on track still time-wise. So the crisis has created new content needs. Emma talks about this a lot. As a creator, you spend a lot of time thinking, what is my content for? And then when something like this comes along, you can really add value. So creators know that their content needs to serve new purposes right now. Haiyan and Luciano talked how there was a lot of logistical needs with their content. So in the first few weeks, it was literally, how can we keep our kids busy when we have so many more hours with them during the day? So advice on TV shows to watch, books, what to do at home. And then Katie in the US also talking about the fact that they were also serving a lot more of these emotional needs. So she, at first, didn't really want to talk about her mental health much, but she was getting so many queries in around mental health, coping mechanisms, that now she has Therapy Thursdays, where her audience basically watches her and her therapist have a live session on IG Live. And she's found that, again, this comes from a completely different need that people are really looking to influence and creators to fulfill. Which leads me perfectly onto this next point, which is that people are looking to connect with creators. And there's a real opportunity here for brands to foster intimacy with audiences through them. So Julia in Italy says that people are seeking one-on-one interaction so much more, with her direct messages up 30%. As well as her, I love this translation, her followers have become hyper gentle, and they always say thank you for this content. So but a lot more of, if she posts a picture that people really enjoy, they're actually going directly to her direct messages to tell her in a way they wouldn't before. Mike LaBelle in the US says the same thing. A lot of people are coming together in gaming. And he talks a lot about how gaming is already such a huge existing community online, but people really, really leaning into that and getting the social interaction they're not getting necessarily in their day-to-day. And this is reflected in China as well. The home creator that we spoke to, she talked a lot about how people have become more interested in interactive content, short videos, live streaming. and how before the outbreak, what people would pay for was very different to what people would pay for now. So live streaming is something that people are paying a lot more for in China, which is very interesting. But obviously, live streaming was already much more established there anyway. People are looking to creators for an escape from reality. There's been a huge back and forth here with people wanting to know, how much humour we can really use at this time. But as Rambo FYI says in the UK, social can be a distraction from the real world. And he has this great quote where he says, you see updates on the pandemic on the news, your mom's going to message you about it on WhatsApp. There's enough meaningful, sad, emotional content out in the world right now. And so the content that he wants to make is about focusing on the good stuff, the fun stuff, not the bad. Melissa says the same thing in Germany. She says that comic relief, it can be a huge public service at this time, and that she laughs a lot about all of these COVID-19 memes, how great a distraction it is. I actually saw a meme the other day which was saying there's definitely going to be like a history class that's taught in 30 years about how memes helped us cope with the coronavirus. I hope to be teaching that class. That's my ambition. And then, and a great example of this in the US, pretty explicit reference to this, but in the US, the blogger Grace Atwood has a newsletter called The Weekly Distraction, which is literally designed to help people find an escape at this time. People are also looking to creators for hope. And again, this comes back to the positive vibes angle that we talked about a little bit before. And I think there's a huge opportunity here for brands to really work with creators to help them provide good news, positive energy, positive vibes. That's what people need now more than ever. In some ways, this is about support. So Emma talks about how the mental health parenting people that she follows, she's found so much relief in very practical posts about how to not beat yourself up and work through stuff, and really reminding her that she's not alone. Valeska says the same thing from Germany. A lot of people are coming together and a real sense of positivity, and she feels obligated to provide this positivity. And then Gemma in Australia says the same. She says she's an inherent optimist without downplaying the difficulty of the changes and health implications that a lot of people are feeling. She can't help but see this as an opportunity to change the way she works and to really create positive change through what she does. Engagement with unpolished content is up. So this is something which I think has been a huge relief for anyone who can't get hold of the production value that they need right now, because increasingly what we're seeing is that there's an opportunity to lean into lo-fi content at this time. And I think there are some long-term implications for this, which we'll address in the after lockdown setting, but certainly for the time being and in the immediate future for countries that are still going to be in lockdown for the coming month. Aspirational content feels really tone deaf in this climate, and that's something that Katie Sands talks about a lot, because her feed is usually very polished and she had to almost completely rethink the way she posts on her grid at this time. Guy kind of backed this up by saying, raw and unpolished aesthetics are thriving, and especially when it comes to live content. But part of the reason live has been so popular is because it's raw and unpolished. People are responding in real time. There's no time to, work out what you're going to say. That's something I'm struggling with right now. But it's really that sense of getting as close as you can with an actual conversation with a creator that people are really enjoying right now. And I think we've seen some incredible examples of this playing out in fields where production value is usually everything. So fashion photography is a really big part of this. In Italy, fashion photographer Alessio Albi, who is kind of renowned for these very glossy images, has been continuing to shoot these super famous and beautiful models, but doing so with webcams and FaceTime and continuing to post almost as normal, but with a different kind of aesthetic, which I think, again, we'll look back on in years to come and analyse and consider and think about at length, no doubt. But yeah, it's a great opportunity for brands to really lean into this kind of content at this time, and also understand that lo-fi content doesn't have to be ugly, which is something that I think is really easy to forget. Finally, in this section, I think people want content they can recreate. So creators are an essential source of inspiration right now. So Flex Mammy talks about the fact that when this first happened, she remembers thinking, oh my God, am I going to be completely non-essential right now? But actually her audience are more engaged than ever and looking to her for inspiration and guidance on what to do at this time. Emma's been seeing the same in the UK. She talks about her art class in particular and how parents really appreciate it when you slim down the ingredients list and keep it simple. So she's moved away from doing craft and moved into art, because for art all you need is a pencil or paints, and if you don't have paints, there are so many other things you can use instead of, having to have like pipe cleaners or tissue paper or some of these things which are much trickier. And so really what the implication here is that there's an opportunity for brands to make content that really helps people fill their time and work with creators to do that. So in Italy, IKEA's Ripartiamo da Casa, terrible Italian accent there, sorry to Donato if you're watching. But this hashtag is especially for people to basically share tips and tricks and things that they can do in their home during lockdown, and really encouraging this kind of open source sharing of ways to improve your home or cook or fill your time or whatever it is. So I'm sure the section that you guys have most been waiting for are panel's predictions for what will change in the long term. So coming back to what we were saying before about how lo-fi content is really killing it right now, I think it's very interesting to think that while this is certainly true, what we will see is certain aspects of social return to normal. So Mackay talks about this a lot and says, right now my followers are more engaged with quarantine content. They want me to show more of who I am. They want this more lo-fi aesthetic. But in general, my aspirational content does do really well with engagement. And so I will need to compromise this when this is over. And this is something which was really came through when we spoke to those in China who are obviously already coming out of lockdown or already out of lockdown and starting to return to some kind of pseudo-normality. And he talked a lot about how, so in China, there is also something called revenge spending. I say in China, I think it's translated from a Chinese phrase, but it's something that's everywhere. But what we're seeing is that as people come out of lockdown, especially if they haven't spent very much, they're looking for things to spend their money on. They're looking for places to go. They're looking to really exercise their freedom. And what Blank talks about here is that because people saw so much similar content when they were staying at home, they've become desperate to see fresh things that are happening outside. So he shared some videos about a trip he took, and these videos attracted so much more attention than he thought they did even from before. So what we'll see, especially directly out of lockdown, is people, really desperate for these aspiration images of places to go and things to see before potentially we rest into ultimate economic crisis and that stuff starts to become distasteful again. But certainly when we first leave lockdown, that's what we'll see. But as Mike says, and I think this is very important and interesting, ultimately the fundamentals of great content haven't changed. The best partnerships are always going to be with creators and companies that both have a belief and vision in the products produced. Something that came up a lot that I didn't even put in here because it's the deathly word authenticity is something, of course, that came through in all of this. And I think many of the fundamentals of social content haven't changed. It's just the context within which they exist. What people look to for creators may change in some aspects, though. So even though many aspects of it will return to normal, we will also see some things change. And will there be a growth in what people will look to creators for? So as I mentioned earlier, Mackay's cooking content has been killing it. And she said that after lockdown, no, there won't be as much of it. And yeah, she will return to some of the things that she posts about. But also we'll see a huge amount of this content stay. And she also talked a lot about, she started talking more about mental health, and that's something else that she's really been thinking she might continue with moving forward. Darcy saw the same thing in China, and she said that now people are allowed out of their houses. They've been inspired during lockdown to reevaluate what they want. So during the outbreak, she said many people realised, for example, that they hadn't been going outside that much previously, and actually that's something they really took for granted. And as a result, many of her followers have been, she's a surfer, and many of her followers have contacted her to arrange offline surfing classes. And because their point of contact to understanding that world, what has been her feed, she's the one they're going to find out about where to go to look to learn how to surf. We're going to see new communities forming. So I think this is a really, really interesting one, kind of off the back of that surf comment, but really hammered home with Guy's comment here from Australia. For some people, these new skills that we're trying out will turn into lifelong interest. So during lockdown, so many people have been learning new skills and thinking about what they want to do with their time. And there will be new communities forming around these skills as we move forward. Even crazier still, something else, again, that I'd never really thought about was that for others, lockdown has held in completely new online habits. So Emma talked about the fact that for her classes, she was getting a lot of people joining them, literally asking, how do I access the live video? How do I tag you in a post? Parents who have never used Instagram before, but got sent her class on a WhatsApp group, and now are on Instagram, and after lockdown will most likely continue to be on there. So thinking about that, we're going to see a whole lot of new users entering on new platforms potentially. And as Mike says, there may also be new influencers, because something that lots of people are doing is kind of spending their time to really launch their own social channels. And he was saying that a lot more casual gamers are becoming creators now because they have the time to dedicate to it. So people who would never usually play for 20 or 30 hours a week now have the time to do so, and are using this time to try and move into that space. This is a very interesting one, and it was something which had a very different response based on which market we're in. So creators will need to stand for something, and brands will too. And there's a really good opportunity here for brands to partner with creators to make positive change. What we've seen is that right now, given everything that's going on, as I mentioned before, a lot of people are really kind of thinking about how they took certain things for granted, and they're getting more in touch with what matters most. So Gemma says people are now more in touch with what's important. So whatever a brand's core purpose or values, it has to come through authentically. So now is the time that that stuff will become even more important than it already was. In Germany, this played out in a very interesting way, because historically creators and influencers haven't been encouraged to talk about politics. It's not something that's really favoured in that market, given cultural history. And she's been saying that recently, suddenly people are showing their political colours, and that's good. People used to say, be quieter, you don't want to potentially alienate brands or clients, but now brands and creators are working together to take a more political stand about the things that they care about. And Darcy echoes this in China. She says that in recent months, given everything that's gone down, brands have actually played a far more important role in people's lives than they had before. And that means that what they're communicating really matters, and people will expect more profound communication in this space. That's an ambiguous veil there. So creators will be seeking more security from brands. So this is a very interesting one from a much more kind of tactical perspective. What we might see is that brands will actually face a lot more regulation from influencer partnerships. So the crisis has really shown the values that creators can add. And certainly from the creators' perspectives, they're very aware. They're obviously getting a lot of feedback from their audiences. They're very aware of the value that they're adding to people's lives. But despite this, Federico in Italy, we'll get in there, he talks a lot among a number of creators about the fact that they've actually lost quite a lot of investment at this time. And even though they're seeing their engagement and their numbers going up, they're seeing a massive downturn in investment, especially at the beginning of the crisis, with the rug really pulled out from beneath them. And so as a result, many of them are feeling, potentially a little bit cautious about who they work with moving forwards, and making sure that their contracts are watertight and all of that stuff. Because as we move forward, as Katie mentions here, building trust will be integral. And if you have been a brand that's really supported your creators at this time and tried to ease that stress, there's a good chance that they will kind of follow you to the ends of the earth after this. There's a good chance we're going to see platform roles diversify. And this again kind of taps back into what Emma was saying before, and we can see she's quoted again here. But some platforms, Instagram in particular, we could see become far more likely to be spaces for educational content. She says that after this, Instagram will continue to be used as a source of education, especially for parents with kids. They're really seeing the value of these digital resources. And once again, coming back to what people will look to creators for, there's a good chance that creators will continue to provide digital courses and online courses when this is over, and really kind of sharing their specific expertise. Other platforms will diversify purely through an uptick in users. I mean, I don't know if anyone's been scrolling through TikTok recently, but there's a lot of very Instagram adjacent content on there right now. Like, I've never seen so many recipes, workouts, all of that content was on there before, but there's so much more of it now because a lot of the creators who were on those other platforms are starting to move over. And in China, we're seeing the same with the travel inspiration platform Zhao Hongshu. So initially, this was very, very aspirational travel, global travel. But since the lockdown began, and even now that it's been over, it's very much shifted its focus to getting around cities and exploring locations much closer to home. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, I don't want to be that guy who says, who has a clickbaity title, but then never answers the actual question in the title. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes now thinking about this question, like, will influencers still add value after lockdown? Although, I mean, I think you're all probably pretty clear on where I stand on this. There's a great quote, once again, from Flex Mami saying that there is a bigger pressure now to find a more creative way to execute your content. Audiences still want to see the minutiae of your day, but not in the way that you saw it before. As the stages of COVID-19 change, they want to see content that's reflective and reflexive of that shift. So you've no doubt seen this, but throughout the pandemic, we've seen macro influencers have come under fire a lot for calling it a great equalizer. Madonna did that from a bathtub filled with petals. There was also the whole Gal Gadot nightmare where she crowdsourced that celebrity cover of Imagine by John Lennon. And ultimately, it's left people feeling like, yeah, celebrities are saying we're all in the same boat, but their boat is a hell of a lot nicer than many other people's boats. And we've seen this a lot, even through, I was watching a webinar recently from Canvas 8, and they were talking about the fact that even though we're experiencing what is ultimately something very collective, everyone's experience of it has been very atomized. And in lots of ways, the pandemic is really kind of shining a light on the inequalities in society. All of that being said, though, when it comes to creativity, in some ways it has been an equalizer, purely because of the fact that the spectrum of tools and inspiration that people have access to has narrowed, and the line between macro and micro has blurred. So on here on the left, you'll see on the far left, this is a picture from Makai's stories, who I mentioned earlier. He has less than 100,000 followers. And it actually looks very, very similar to this, which is from Gigi Hadid, who is obviously very much a macro influencer. Then on the right here, you've got, if we look at live content, you've got Cardi B on the right and Lydia Dingo on the left, who also has less than 100,000 followers. So what we're seeing is that just the size and scope of influencers and their followings is really starting to close the gap. And there's been a very much a blurring of content in this time. And ultimately that leads on to the fact that homogenization and content fatigue are increasingly prevalent in digital space. Julia from Italy pretty brutally says that so many of the profiles I used to follow now bore me to death. Those who were always going on events and traveling, they should have invented something new, but instead they just stopped communicating. And as a result, there's a real awareness that in this landscape, differentiation is integral. Because if, as Emma says, if there's not something that people don't need immediately, they are skipping over it. This is a problem that isn't going anywhere, because even once we're all out of lockdown, our experiences will continue to be shaped around a unified set of hopes and anxieties. Many of the way that we shop and socialise and experience the world are still going to be very similar, and a lot of the needs that content is trying to help with will continue to exist. For one, we're still going to be spending so much more time in our houses. So in the coming months, the main hurdle we're going to have to overcome is differentiation. Anna Kraft talks about how bucking trends will become increasingly important. You know, everyone's posted their banana bread or their sourdough or their fitness at home. It's become a real overload. Everyone's doing the same thing. And also, even if creators are doing something that people really, really want to do, like there has been screen fatigue, with Gemma talking about how after 12 hours of doing nothing but looking at your computer, it just becomes too much. So differentiation will become a problem. But what we've seen even from the creators that we've spoken to for this study, there are so many incredible ways that they're adapting like no other. So in Australia, Guy saw that there was a lot of cooking, and he also saw there were a lot of food boxes, but he kind of combined the two to build recipes into food delivery boxes for inexperienced chefs. As I mentioned, in the US, we had Katie with her Therapy Thursdays. And on the right in the UK, we had Emma with her live art classes. And there were reams of other people that we spoke to who were doing incredibly interesting things. And so when thinking about will app influencers still add value after lockdown, I can't help but think that they'll be integral in helping brands differentiate in a content landscape that's more saturated than ever and will continue to be so in the coming months. Cool. So I'm going to leave you here. And I think Alice is going to come on the line so that she can help me in correctly.
Can you hear me all right, Laura?
Do you want me to leave my screener?
Yeah, why not? So thanks for that. It was super interesting. We've got a ton of questions. I think we've probably got time to get through 2 or 3. So the first one is, great to see so many insights from the influencers themselves. Did you notice any major regional differences in the insights?
So what's really fascinating about this is that there were of course certain regional differences, but so many of the insights came through again and again the same. So even something like the lo-fi content versus the aspirational content, that's something that you would think might be only certain markets, but across the board, it came through again and again. I think where the biggest differences were, well, of course, I think you guys have probably noticed that China mostly came out in the after lockdown section because, of course, they're far further along than most of the other markets. And so what we saw with China wasn't actually a difference, which is what I would expect um, given how culturally different China is to, say, certainly like the US and the UK. But actually what we saw was a more of an evolution of those behaviours. So yeah, lo-fi content had done great during lockdown, but after lockdown, aspirational was coming back far stronger than before. And I think we may see some differentiation start to happen as the rest of us come out of lockdown as well. Another really important one I think to note is Germany, where Germany is kind of more, like I say, has a very different political landscape. And so what we saw in Germany was definitely much more shock at the kind of political values that were being spoken about, which weren't really at all.
Thanks, super interesting. The next question is, people are predicting this new normal will be until the end of 2020. Should we continue to recommend to clients to create more relatable or aspirational content rather than product-centric content?
I think that insight from China, I think, is bang on. But when people get freedom, I mean, we've seen it already in the UK. So now that we're allowed to meet one person at a socially distanced level, everyone is like at the park with one person from another household. I think people will want to exercise as much freedom as they possibly can within the restrictions that we're given. So once we're allowed to travel again, for example, I think we will see a lot more people wanting to see aspirational travel content, for example. But I think coming back to that point I was saying about, it's not necessarily about aspirational versus not aspirational, but about making sure that whatever content we're making is sending the right message for the safety of society, and that has to be front and center. We just can't leave ourselves or the creators we're working with vulnerable to the huge amounts of criticism that they're getting if they are encouraging any behavior that isn't 100% by the book.
Right, and the next question is from Kana. With so much noise around similar subjects, what do you think influencers and agencies alike can do to cut through the COVID noise?
So I think it's about collaborating with creators. So something that we spoke about a lot, which didn't get into the final deck because there was so much in here, is if you are a food brand and you're thinking about doing a cook along or something, don't just go to a creator and say, I want you to do a cook along. Go to the creator and say, I really want to do a cook along, but I'm worried about the noise. How can we create a cook along that will cut through? And really work with those creators to shape those ideas, because they're aware of what's already out there. If you're a parenting influencer, you know what every other parenting influencer is doing. If you're a gaming influencer, you have a pretty good idea of what the gaming community is doing. So you can go with an idea about the kind of behaviours you want to tap into, but I think really collaborating with the creators and the influencers to get to what the cut-through version of that looks like will be incredibly important. And like I say, even from all of these, like, they are so tapped in. They can tell you the difference between their followers now and 2 weeks ago and predict about what they might be in 2 weeks from now. So I think really leaning into that knowledge when you're working with them on briefs is a really good way to do that.
Right, and then the final question comes from Johan, who says, coming from an agency in a small country like Malta, some brands, mainly for financial reasons, struggle to recognise the importance of influencer collaborations, especially right now. What do you think is the best way to bring this point across to uncertain brands and clients?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go heavy on the same insights over and over again, but I think right now creators are not only like a creative output and a space for brand awareness, but also directly tap into audience insights. And I think tapping into the fact that they know their audience is better, and so they can differentiate your content better than anyone else can. We did have a habit of, as agencies and as brands, of kind of being like, we know pretty much what the landscape is like, but in this situation we do not, and they do. And so I think leaning into that and leaning into the power that their knowledge gives them to create genuinely cut through content is really of prime importance.
Thanks, Laura. That's all we've got time for today. So I'll let you close off.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. It's been so much fun.